Administrator had spent 40 years working for the Galactic Veterans Administration. She had seen warriors from 100 different species pass through her stations. She had watched them arrive as heroes and leave as hollow shells of their former selves. The problem was always the same. Their bodies healed, but something inside them stayed broken. There were the worst cases. They were tall beings covered in dark green scales with 4 arms and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. They were born for war. Their entire culture celebrated combat and honor and glory. But when the fighting stopped, many of them simply could not cope. They would wake screaming in the middle of the night. They would attack medical staff who approached too quickly. Some of them stopped eating entirely. Others took what they called the final honor, ending their own lives rather than living with their memories. They were different but just as troubled. They were beings with hard exoskeletons and compound eyes that saw in spectrums most species could not imagine. They communicated partly through clicks and partly through chemical signals. When they experienced trauma, they often went silent. They would stop producing the chemical signals that let them connect with others. They became isolated inside their own shells, unable to reach out even when they wanted to. They were perhaps the saddest cases of all. They were small creatures that moved in coordinated swarms, their individual bodies connected through a shared consciousness. When members of their swarm died in combat, the survivors felt each death as if it were their own. Some lost so many swarm mates that they could no longer function. They would wander aimlessly, searching for connections that no longer existed. Had tried everything the galaxy had to offer. The best developed species-specific treatments, the received meditation chambers that were tuned to their brain patterns. They were given chemical supplements designed to restart their social bonding. They were introduced to artificial swarm mates, synthetic beings meant to fill the gaps in their consciousness. None of it worked. Not really. The veterans might improve for a while, but they always seemed to slide back into darkness. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. These beings had experienced horrors that changed them forever, and no amount of technology could undo that change. Then found the humans. She had been reviewing old survey data from the outer rim of the galaxy when she came across the file on Earth. It was a small planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. The dominant species called themselves humans. They had only recently developed faster-than-light travel and had made limited contact with the galactic community. What caught attention was not their technology or their biology. It was their history. Humans had been fighting wars against each other for as long as they had existed. They had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet multiple times over. They had experienced mass casualties on scales that would break most species entirely. And yet they kept going. Dug deeper into the records, she found something called the World Wars, conflicts that had killed millions of humans in just a few years. She found smaller wars that had continued for decades, grinding down entire generations. She found terrorism and genocide and atrocities that made even her hardened administrator's heart ache. But she also found something else. She found that humans had developed ways to help their traumatized warriors. They called it therapy. They called it counseling. They had organizations dedicated entirely to helping veterans cope with their experiences. They had support groups where warriors gathered to share their pain with others who understood. Most remarkably, they had discovered that the best people to help traumatized veterans were often other veterans, humans who had been through the worst of combat and somehow found a way to carry on. These humans did not try to fix their fellow veterans or cure them. They simply sat with them. They listened. They said things like, "I know what you mean and I have been there too." Submitted her proposal to the Galactic Council the next day. She requested permission to recruit human counselors for the veteran stations. The council was skeptical at first. Humans were primitive by galactic standards. What could they possibly offer that more advanced species could not provide? But was persistent. She presented the data. She showed them the suicide rates among human veterans compared to other species. She showed them how those rates dropped dramatically when veterans received peer support from others who shared their experiences. She argued that what humans lacked in technology, they made up for in hard-won wisdom. The council approved her proposal on a trial basis. They would send human counselors to one station for one standard year. If the results were promising, the program could expand. 3 months later, the first group of human counselors arrived at Station 7. There were 12 of them in total. They were smaller than had expected, soft-bodied creatures with smooth skin in various shades of brown and pink. They had only 2 arms and 2 legs. Their eyes did not glow. They had no natural weapons, no armor, no obvious defenses against the dangerous universe around them. The alien veterans did not know what to make of them. Was a warrior who had earned more combat honors than almost anyone alive. He had fought in the Borderlands campaign for 6 years. He had once held a defensive position alone for 6 days against an enemy force that outnumbered him 50 to 1. His body was covered in scars that he wore with pride, but had not slept properly in 2 years. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the enemies he had killed. He heard their screams. He felt their blood on his scales. During the day, he was jumpy and aggressive. Loud noises made him drop into combat stances. Shadows made him reach for weapons that were no longer there. When told him that his new counselor was a human, almost laughed. He reported to the counseling room, expecting to spend a few minutes humoring this small creature before returning to his quarters. He found a human female sitting in a chair that was far too big for her. She had gray hair and lines on her face that suggested age. Her name tag said Maria Santos. Lowered himself into the chair across from her. His 4 arms crossed over his chest in a gesture of dismissal. He looked down at her with barely concealed contempt. Maria Santos did not seem bothered by his attitude. She simply looked up at him with calm brown eyes and said hello. Grunted in response. Maria asked him if he wanted to talk about anything. Said no. Maria nodded and said that was fine. They could just sit for a while if he preferred. They sat in silence for almost an hour. Expected the human to become impatient, to try to force conversation, to give up and leave. But Maria just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing slow and steady. Finally spoke. He did not know why. The words just came out. He told her about the siege. Not the heroic version that appeared in his official record, but the real version. The version where he had been terrified every single moment. The version where he had killed so many enemies that their bodies formed a wall around his position. The version where he had stopped seeing them as people and started seeing them as obstacles to be removed. He told her about the faces, how they visited him every night, how he could not escape them no matter how hard he tried. When he finished, he expected Maria to recoil. He expected her to look at him with horror or disgust. He expected her to tell him that he was broken, that he needed medication, that he needed to try harder to control his thoughts. Instead, she nodded slowly. Her eyes never left his. "Yes," she said, "I know that weight." Stared at her. "What do you mean?" Maria was quiet for a moment. Then she told him about her own war. She had served 2 tours in a place called Afghanistan. She had been part of a unit that cleared buildings in hostile territory. She had killed people too. She had seen her friends die. She had done things that still woke her up at night, even decades later. Listened in stunned silence. This small, fragile creature had experienced combat. She had killed. She had lost people she cared about. She carried the same weight that he did. "How do you live with it?" he asked. Maria smiled sadly. "One day at a time," she said. "Some days are harder than others, but talking about it helps. Knowing that someone else understands helps. You are not alone in this. You never were." For the first time in 2 years, felt something other than pain. He felt the faint stirring of hope. Word spread quickly through the veteran wards of Station 7. The humans understood. This phrase echoed through corridors and common rooms. passed from patient to patient in a dozen different languages. The humans understood. It was not that the alien veterans had expected the counselors to be incompetent. The Galactic Veterans Administration had employed excellent for centuries. These professionals knew everything about alien brain chemistry and trauma responses and therapeutic techniques. They could recite treatment protocols from memory. They could diagnose conditions with perfect accuracy. But they had never been to war. The human counselors were different. They had walked through the same darkness that haunted the veterans they treated. They did not just understand trauma in theory. They understood it in their bones, in their nightmares, in the scars that covered their bodies and minds. James was a tall human male with dark brown skin and a shaved head. He walked with a slight limp from an injury he had received years ago. He had been assigned to work with the veterans, which everyone agreed was a difficult task. They were notoriously hard to reach when they went silent. His first patient was named, had been a combat engineer responsible for clearing explosive devices from enemy territory. One day, a device detonated before he could disarm it. The explosion killed his entire unit and nearly killed him. Surgeons had rebuilt most of his exoskeleton using synthetic materials. His body worked again. His mind did not. Had not spoken a single word since the accident. He did not click. He did not produce chemical signals. He sat in his room and stared at the wall day after day as if waiting for something that would never come. They had tried everything. They had adjusted his brain chemistry. They had stimulated his communication centers. They had brought in others to try to reach him through the swarm bond. Nothing worked. After 6 months of silence, the medical staff had declared a lost cause. They continued to feed him and monitor his health, but they had given up hope of reaching him. Then James arrived. On his first day, James went to his room and sat down in a chair near the bed. He did not try to touch or force eye contact. He did not bring any equipment or medication. He just sat there. Did not react at all. James came back the next day and did the same thing, and the day after that, and the day after that. For 7 days, James sat in silence asking nothing and expecting nothing. The medical staff thought he was wasting his time. Some of them laughed behind his back. On the 8th day, James started talking. He did not talk about or ask questions about the accident. Instead, he talked about himself. He talked about a place called Iraq, where he had served as a young soldier. He talked about a convoy that he had been part of, traveling down a dangerous road in an armored vehicle. He talked about the bomb. James described the moment of the explosion in simple, plain words. He talked about the noise and the heat, and the feeling of being thrown through the air. He talked about waking up surrounded by wreckage, his ears ringing, his leg broken in 3 places. He talked about looking around and realizing that everyone else in his vehicle was dead. He talked about being the only survivor. James paused for a long moment after saying this. His voice had grown quiet and rough. He looked at the floor, lost in memories that still hurt after all these years. Then he heard a sound. It was soft, barely audible, a clicking noise like 2 stones tapping together. James looked up and saw staring at him. His compound eyes, which had been dull and lifeless for months, now held a faint spark of something that might have been recognition. "You were the only one," clicked. The translation device rendered his words in a flat, mechanical voice, but James could hear the emotion underneath. "Yes," James said. Was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his clicks were hesitant and slow, like a muscle that had not been used in too long. "How do you continue?" James considered the question carefully. He had asked himself the same thing many times over the years. The answer was not simple. "Some days I do not know," he said honestly. "Some days it is just putting one foot in front of the other. But I found that helping others gave my survival some meaning. People who have been through similar things. Like maybe I am still here for a reason." His mandibles clicked softly. In culture, soul survivors were considered cursed. They were touched by death, marked by failure. To survive when others died was shameful. Had been carrying this shame for months, letting it eat away at him from the inside. But this human wore his survival differently. Not as a curse or a shame. He wore it as a responsibility. "You help others like me?" asked. "I try to," James said. "Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not, but trying is better than giving up." This was a new idea for the concept that survival could have purpose, that his continued existence might mean something other than failure and shame. He did not speak again that day, but the next day when James arrived was sitting up in bed instead of lying down. It was a small change, but James recognized it for what it was, a first step. Meanwhile, Maria Santos was making progress with the veterans. She had introduced them to something called a support group. It was a simple concept that most galactic cultures had never considered. You gathered together a group of veterans who had experienced similar trauma. Then you let them talk to each other. The idea seemed almost dangerous at first. Culture emphasized strength and self-reliance. Warriors were supposed to handle their problems alone. Showing weakness to others was disgraceful. The idea of deliberately exposing your pain to a group of strangers was almost unthinkable. But Maria was patient. She explained that the support group was not about showing weakness. It was about sharing strength. Every veteran in the room had already proven their courage in battle. Now they would prove it again by facing their trauma together instead of alone. The first support group meeting was awkward and uncomfortable. 8 warriors sat in a circle, their scales shifting colors with embarrassment and anxiety. No one wanted to speak first. No one wanted to be the one who broke the silence. Then Maria spoke. She talked about her own struggles with coming home from war. She talked about the nightmares and the flashbacks, and the way loud noises still made her flinch sometimes. She talked about feeling disconnected from civilians who had never experienced combat. She talked about the guilt she carried for surviving when others had died. They listened in astonishment. This small, fragile human had experienced the same things they had. She knew the same darkness, and here she was, speaking openly about it without shame or hesitation. One by one, the warriors began to share their own stories. They talked about battles that still haunted them. They talked about friends they had lost. They talked about the things they had done to survive, things that weighed on their hearts even now. For many of them, it was the first time they had ever spoken these words out loud. The relief was almost physical. They could see it in the way their scales slowly shifted to calmer colors. They could hear it in the way their voices steadied as they spoke. After the meeting, an officer named Ara approached Maria. She was tall even by standards, with scales that were almost black. She had been a squadron commander in the Borderlands campaign. She had lost half her unit in a single disastrous battle. "How did you know?" Ara asked. "How did you know that talking would help?" Maria smiled. "Because I have been doing this for a long time. Humans have been hurting each other for thousands of years. We have learned some things about healing along the way." Ara considered this. "Your species is very strange," she said finally. "You are weak and short-lived and you fight each other constantly, but you understand suffering better than anyone else I have met." Maria nodded. "Maybe that is because we have had so much practice." The news of the support group spread throughout the station. Other species began asking if they could participate. They wanted to try. They wanted to try. Even species that had never had formal contact with humans wanted to know more about these strange counseling techniques. Watched the changes with growing amazement. Veterans who had been given up as hopeless cases were starting to improve. The suicide rate on Station 7 dropped by half within the first 3 months. Patients who had refused to speak were opening up. Patients who had refused to eat were regaining their appetites. The human counselors had accomplished in weeks what decades of advanced galactic medicine had failed to achieve. But not everyone was happy about it. The hearing chamber on Station 7 was designed to intimidate. It was a vast circular room with walls that stretched up into darkness. The seats were arranged in rising tiers around a central platform, so that whoever stood in the middle would feel surrounded and small. The lighting was harsh and cold. Maria Santos stood alone on the central platform. She was aware of how tiny she looked in this enormous space. The observers in the surrounding seats were mostly military officials, their scales glinting with medals and decorations. Behind the main podium sat Admiral Axe, commander of the Third Fleet and one of the most decorated warriors in the Empire. Axe had filed a formal complaint against the Human Counseling Program. He believed that it was corrupting the fighting spirit of veterans. He had demanded a hearing to address his concerns. Maria had been called to defend the program. The Admiral looked down at her with undisguised contempt. His scales were a deep red color that signified anger and aggression. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonic undertones that made every word sound like a threat. "You teach our warriors to speak of fear," Axe said, "to admit weakness, to cry as your species does. This is not healing. This is degradation." Maria met his gaze without flinching. She had faced worse odds before. She had stood in rooms full of hostile officials before. She had learned long ago that showing fear only encouraged predators. "Admiral," she said, her voice calm and steady with respect, "I would like to ask you a question. How many veterans took their own lives last cycle?" Axe's scales flickered, shifting briefly to a color that suggested discomfort. "That information is classified," he said. "I have seen the numbers," Maria replied. "Your species calls it the final honor, a warrior's choice to end their suffering rather than burden their clan. Last cycle, you lost more soldiers to suicide than you lost in the entire Borderlands campaign." Silence fell over the chamber. This was not something that was discussed publicly in culture. The final honor was considered a private matter, a dignified end to unbearable pain. To speak of it so openly was almost scandalous. Maria continued before anyone could object. "My species has been fighting wars for 10,000 years. We have learned some things the hard way. We learned that pretending trauma does not exist does not make it go away. It just makes it fester. We learned that the bravest thing a warrior can do is not dying in battle. It is living afterward with all the memories and still choosing to face another day." She turned slowly, addressing the full assembly rather than just the Admiral. "You asked us here because nothing else was working. Your warriors were breaking and you did not know how to fix them. Well, I will tell you the secret. You cannot fix them. Trauma is not a malfunction to be repaired. It is a wound, and wounds need time and care to heal. What we offer is not a cure. It is a way to carry the weight together so no one has to carry it alone." Axe's scales shifted through several colors in rapid succession. Before he could respond, a voice called out from the gallery. "I request permission to testify." Everyone turned to look. A tall was standing in the observer section. His scales were dark green and covered with old scars. Maria recognized him immediately. It was. The guards moved toward him, but Axe raised a hand to stop them. The Admiral studied for a long moment. He knew the warrior's reputation. Everyone did, was a legend among the military. "Permission granted," Axe said finally. Made his way down to the central platform. He walked with the confident grace of a lifelong warrior, but there was something different about him now, something calmer. He stopped beside Maria, towering over her small human form. Then, before the entire assembly, he did something that no had ever done in public. He bowed to her. "This human saved my life," said. His voice carried clearly through the chamber, not with weapons, not with medicine, with understanding. "She looked at my darkness and did not flinch. She taught me that survival is not shameful, it is sacred." He straightened and looked directly at Admiral Axe. "I was ready to take the final honor," he continued. "I had chosen the day. I had made my peace with death. Then this small creature from a primitive world sat with me and listened to my pain. She told me that she understood because she had felt the same pain herself. She did not try to fix me or cure me. She just helped me carry the weight. Now I counsel other veterans, said. As she counseled me, I teach them what she taught me. That talking about our pain does not make us weak, it makes us stronger. I am not degraded, I am more than I was. For a long moment no one spoke. Then movement began in the gallery. A veteran stood up from his seat. Then a cluster rose together. Then more warriors. One by one, veterans from different species rose to their feet, standing in solidarity with the human woman who had helped them find their way back from darkness. Was among them. The who had been silent for months clicked loudly, his mandibles creating patterns that his translation device rendered as I stand with the humans. Admiral Axe looked at the standing veterans for a long time. His scales shifted through a complex sequence of colors that Maria could not interpret. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its aggressive harmonics. "The complaint is withdrawn," he said. "The program will continue." Maria let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Around her, the standing veterans began to click and chirp and hum in their various languages. The sounds blended together into something that almost resembled celebration. Later that evening, Maria sat alone in her quarters. She was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. The hearing had drained her, but it had also filled her with something she had not felt in a long time: hope. There was a chime at her door. She opened it to find standing in the corridor. He had to duck to enter her quarters, his massive frame barely fitting through the human-sized doorway. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did today." Settled himself on the floor since none of her furniture could support his weight. "I spoke only the truth," he said. "You did save my life." Maria smiled. "You saved your own life. I just helped you see that it was worth saving." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Outside the viewport, stars drifted slowly past as the station rotated. "Your species is remarkable," said finally. "You are small and soft and fragile. You have no scales or claws or natural weapons, and yet you have learned to survive things that would destroy most beings." Maria considered this. "Maybe that is why we developed these techniques," she said. "We had to find ways to heal because we could not afford to lose anyone. Every human matters because there are so few of us compared to the universe." Made a sound that might have been laughter. Few compared to the universe. Yes, I suppose that is true of all of us. 10 years later, the Galactic Veterans Administration had human counselors stationed on over 300 worlds. The program had grown beyond anything had imagined when she first proposed it. Suicide rates had dropped across every species that participated. A new generation of alien counselors, trained in human methods, was taking over the work. Maria Santos retired to a small station on the edge of known space. She tended a garden there, growing earth plants in artificial soil under artificial sunlight, tomatoes and basil and flowers that reminded her of home. Sometimes old friends came to visit, stopped by whenever his travels brought him nearby, sent messages regularly, updating her on his own counseling work with veterans. Even Admiral Axe had visited once to apologize for his earlier opposition and to thank her for what she had done for his people. Maria had never expected her broken pieces to become tools for healing others. She had spent years carrying her trauma like a weight around her neck, convinced that it made her damaged and incomplete. But she had learned that wounds could become wisdom, that survival could become service, that the darkness she had walked through had given her a light to share with others. Humans were stubborn creatures. They found ways to keep going even when the universe gave them every reason to stop. And sometimes, that stubbornness was exactly what the galaxy needed.